Hey there, I'm Joey from EDHREC. Let's talk about some data. Every week on the EDHREC podcast, we challenge the stats, a segment where we turn a critical eye towards the data on EDHREC. Just because a card is popular doesn't mean it's necessarily the right card for you. And we also love to find cool hidden gems that folks maybe don't know about all that much. As we like to say, there's a lot of data on EDHREC, but we don't always agree with it. We've been doing this for near 300 episodes now, and even though there are some episodes where we skip the usual segments because we've got like a guest on or something, overall we're still talking like 700 to 800 cards challenged over the years. And if you'd like to see our historical challenge to stats spreadsheet, that is a Patreon perk. Link and information about that will be in the description below. And also there's a link to all of our deck lists there too. A lot of people ask about that, but yeah, it's all down there for you. Having done this for a while now, and having read a lot of challenge the stats submissions, I thought it might be worthwhile to go over a few small details that are important to that process. Because the thing is, when you're talking about the data on EDHREC, when you're challenging those stats, you're not saying that EDHREC is wrong for reporting the numbers, right? You're saying that the players are wrong for how they're using the cards. And that's something that shouldn't be done carelessly. I think it makes us better players if we think about how to approach that with nuance. So let's try to do so. First, and probably most important, calling a card underplayed, that's easy. Calling it overplayed, that's hard. Hidden gems are abound in this format. Every commander has weird abilities that take obscure cards and turn them into total powerhouses. And even then, there are still plenty of other strange cards that people don't know about too, and we love highlighting those hidden gems all the time. And frankly, it's fun to do so. Like when I first saw the card Bequeathal, I was like, heck yeah, Amazi decks are gonna love this. Muldrotha decks will love this. I gotta talk about this one. But for every card you add, you have to cut something. It can't all be underplayed cards. But cutting is the hardest part of the brewing process, by far. Telling someone to take a card out of their deck is 10 times harder than finding a cool potential synergy. Because the reality is, we don't have stragglers in our decks these days. To make room for a card that has a cool synergy, you have to cut another card that has a really cool synergy, and you have to explain why one is possibly more advantageous than the other, even though they're both excellent. The cards that don't make it into our final decks are still bangers. You could make an extremely good Marin deck just out of the cards in the maybe board of your Marin deck. Frankly, that's been true for a while now. For instance, one of the first ever cards my co-host Matt challenged back in like episode 7 of the show was Brainstorm. And his concern is a good one. In the Commander format, you're not using Brainstorm in the same ways that make it shine in formats like Legacy. For instance, in EDH, you rarely ever have to brainstorm defensively against hand attack. It's not uncommon for players to brainstorm lock themselves too, putting 2 cards they don't need back on top of their deck that they have no way to get rid of, so they'll draw those cards again anyway. Maybe it's because in EDH, compared to Legacy, their deck has a lower density of fetch lands to shuffle away the cards they don't want, for example. And in that card slot, maybe they could have played some other blue cantrip that would have allowed them to shuffle or scry away those cards instead. But even then, calling Brainstorm overplayed still requires care. Matt will be the first to tell you that Brainstorm is still excellent in decks like Yannette, who manipulates the top cards of her deck. It's been printed in 5 or 6 different Commander precons, such as Galea, who cares about the top card of your deck, or in a precon with Melek, who also cares about the top card of your deck, or in the Zephi precon, who can scry away the cards that you don't want. It shows up in 80% of decks like Niv Mizzet Perun, Locust God, and Min, who all give huge bonuses when you draw extra cards. Don't underestimate the power a single commander can have too. Brainstorm is in 86% of Yuriko decks, and she's the number 5 commander of all time. So a full 16,000 of Brainstorm's inclusions are from one commander alone. Plus, it's not just about the synergy with the commander. Varen decks, for instance, are bonkers popular, and they play Brainstorm too because more than half of those decks also use cards like Niv Mizzet Perun in the 99 to benefit off of those draws as well. So yeah, I'll co-sign with Matt that Brainstorm is still used more often in EDH than it necessarily needs to be. It has a certain reputation in Magic overall that doesn't always translate into Commander in the same ways, and yet some players still use it without properly taking those differences into account. But I'll also co-sign with Matt that there are still plenty of good reasons to play that very popular card. And I admire Matt for addressing those caveats, because if you don't address them, you risk giving bad deck advice, and you risk failing to tackle the realities of the players who use that card the most often. And the reason I find this this important is because these days, near on every card has caveats like that. For instance, there will be cards that aren't really good in the general green stompy oeuvre, but they'd be really good in a spiders deck, or cards that aren't that great for the typical artifacts type of deck, but food decks can make great use of them. Not only that, but commanders often also have multiple different possible build paths. For instance, a lot of aristocrats cards are uber popular for Thalys decks, but I know that they wouldn't be suitable for my Thalys deck because my Thalys deck is way more combat oriented. I'm not going to call any of those aristocrats cards overplayed for her or overrated in that deck. It's just a totally different strategy. Or I have decks where I'll play some subpar creatures instead of more effective and efficient spells, because in those decks I'm trying to keep a high creature count density to help make other cards in the deck really shine. But some folks might prefer to stick to the more reliable spells instead. Neither way is wrong, those are just differences in strategy. It's a difference in personal gameplay preferences, and the stats are correct to show a diversity of play patterns. And that's to say nothing of meta differences. As a light example here, in my playgroups I don't often see creature spells proactively getting countered, for instance, so we often put a higher priority on the spells that tend to counter non-creature spells since we use them more defensively, and we tend to prioritize those more efficient mana costs. But people who play more of those catch-all counter spells, or who play stuff that prevents their creatures from being countered, I don't think they reached that conclusion from nowhere. Their experience is just a little bit different from mine. I'm not going to call any of those things overplayed, because then I'd be assuming that my meta is the meta. And while there are some universally true things about the Commander format, I don't think that's one of them. That sounds way too subjective for me to make assertions about how other people are building their decks. Frankly, some of my favorite cards to challenge are non-bows, like Arcane Signet in a colorless deck, for example. This is just a weird rules thing, and it's easy to miss, but technically, in that deck, Arcane Signet wouldn't be able to tap for any mana. That's not a strategical choice, it's just a weird rules interaction, so yeet it out of your lists. But here's the awkward thing that happens. Sometimes when players talk to each other about over and underplayed cards, for the sake of conversational expediency, they'll breeze past some of those complexities, caveats, and nuances that we mentioned earlier, and they'll just jump right to the fun phrases, like yeet it out of your lists, or they'll try and grab attention by saying something bold. And that type of talk can result in some sweeping statements that aren't necessarily true or helpful, such as, to take a random example, the people who still, to this day, message me saying that bounce lands are unplayable, or when folks say that XYZ new card is an auto-include in Commander. And just no, it's not. The number of cards that I've seen referred to as auto-includes would appear to imply that Commander players are allowed to play 400 card decks. They can't all be auto-includes, you have to cut some. I guess I kind of lied before. The one place that it is harder to talk about underplayed cards compared to overplayed cards is not when you're talking about underplayed in a specific commander's deck, but when you're talking about that card's role in the format at large. Because no matter how much we love any new white creature removal spell that comes out, the reality is that when you zoom out and look at the format as a whole, they are competing against Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, and those things are not getting unseated anytime soon. And ultimately, I think that the most interesting conversations and the greatest amount of learning happens when we're carefully critiquing those 101st and 102nd cards and whether or not they actually should make it into the deck, rather than having blanket statements that don't actually focus in on those particulars. And all of this leads me to another really important thing when talking about a card's popularity and whether it's over or underplayed, and that's that the raw numbers of a card don't matter nearly as much as its percentage. For instance, colorless cards can appear in more decks than multicolored cards, so they're competing against completely different sample sizes. Burnished Heart and Anguished Unmaking both show up in 180,000 EDH decks. There are millions of decks in the database, though, so what do those numbers mean? Is that high? Is that low? A better way to phrase this would be this. One of them shows up in 6% of decks that could play it, which is to say, all decks, whereas the other is only eligible to appear in decks that include black and white, and it appears in 24% of those. Near on a quarter of decks that can play it are playing it. Now that is noteworthy. That's informative. That tells me something that the raw numbers cannot. Not only that, but data is kind of only important relative to other data. Some folks may look at that Anguished Unmaking's 24% inclusion rate and still say that it's too low. But it's worth pointing out that out of the tens of thousands of Commander legal cards that exist out there are only 536 cards that appear in 5% or more of the decks they're eligible to show up in. And honestly, the cards at that 5% threshold are huge. You know what other stuff shows up at 5% inclusion? Archaeomancer's Map, Consecrated Sphinx, Ravenous Chupacabra, Hellkite Tyrant, Second Harvest. We're talking some real cream of the crop cards here. To even make it to the 3% mark is impressive. Disrupt Decorum is in 3% of eligible decks, and that's one of my favorite red spells ever. Even Soul Ring doesn't show up in 100% of eligible decks, and we did a whole video about why. Link in the description, check it out, it's fascinating stuff. So when you think a card might be underplayed, don't just pay attention to its numbers, pay attention to its data relative to other data. And even when it's at something like a 3% inclusion, keep in mind that that's actually pretty decent. Because again, we're talking about millions of decks and millions of players here. And of course, we can't forget about the role price plays here too. A card that a lot of people want to play drives up a high price tag, but a high price tag drives down the number of people who can acquire it. So when a really good card looks really underplayed, I mean, maybe in an ideal world that's true, but this isn't necessarily a strategical reason, right? If that card is $20+, that's probably not a strategy thing. It's probably just people being practical and responsible with their money. This game is expensive. I mean, heck, even challenging a pricey card as overplayed can be tricky too. Because what if someone just went out and got their snazzy, cool, expensive card, only to pop on a video or pop into a game store and hear a bunch of people say that it's a waste of money and that it's way overrated? I don't know, that feels like a pretty big feel-bad moment right there, too. If I were to challenge an expensive card as potentially overplayed, I guess the way I'd want to go about it is more to phrase it as like, if you don't have this pricey card, don't worry about it. You're not necessarily missing out on too much. You can live without it, and here's why. And price has a long-lasting effect on data here. Take Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile as an example. Swords to Plowshares has been pretty affordable and regularly reprinted, and it's currently showing up in 62% of decks that are eligible to play it. Whereas Path to Exile was like $8 or $9 for many a year, and it's only recently gotten more regular reprintings that help keep it more affordable, and it's showing up in 40% of eligible decks. Now, make no mistake, like, that's still a huge number, to be clear, but like 40% versus 62%, that's quite a difference. If you saw those numbers and just took them at face value, it might lead you to conclude that one of them is significantly better than the other. And indeed, I've seen people accuse Path to Exile of being a bad card in EDH, which, obviously I don't agree. The difference to me is academic at best, because practically speaking, I don't have a deck that plays one, but not the other. Both spells are so radically efficient that they absolutely deserve their spots in the top 10 most played cards of the format. Challenging stats, talking with complexity about over and underplayed cards, talking about the actions that other players have made when they are building their decks, that's important so that we don't just take things at face value and we don't accidentally come away with those bad conclusions. It's important so that we can engage with those numbers more critically, because when we properly scrutinize it, we'll realize that the differences between, for example, Path and Swords isn't about how those cards behave in game, but it's more likely the result of things like historical card price or how regularly and frequently one was reprinted in available precons. And those types of understandings will help us perform better in our own deck building. And these can reveal interesting things about player behavior, and we notice certain patterns, certain tropes that we like to call out, like the Precon Effect, for instance. EDHREC doesn't scrape exact Precon duplicate lists, but lots of people will get a Precon and tweak like 10 cards and then throw their list online. And that sometimes results in a card appearing super popular for a specific commander just because it appeared in that original pre-constructed list, and it happened to make it past the round of swaps that first happened before that list was put online. Even though, if you really zoomed out and thought about it, you maybe wouldn't have included that card in the list if you were building that deck from scratch. Or another trope is the forgotten set syndrome, where so many sets are printed these days that some real gems just get completely buried and overlooked because 3 other sets came out in the blink of an eye and it's all too much to keep track of. Plenty of cards remain popular because they are perceived to be popular. Plenty of cards get overlooked for reasons that have nothing to do with whether or not they'd be good in XYZ commander deck. And engaging with those numbers doesn't just tell you about individual player decisions, but can also sometimes speak to things about the format overall. As we say, EDHREC isn't a prescription. It's not a blueprint that players must follow. It's a mirror that shows what people are currently doing. It's a comprehensive tool, an interesting database that can illuminate the places that a deck could go. And it uses things like advanced filters to help you find what's right for you. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, helping you find cards that you want to play. And in case it's not obvious yet, the real thing I'm talking about in this video isn't challenge the stats. The real thing that I'm talking about is deck advice. Helping other people build decks is awesome and complicated. Giving someone else bad advice that would actually detract from their enjoyment, That sucks. For me, it's very painful. Frankly, it scares me. Like, I don't want to do that. As much as my job is about playing the YouTube game, I don't know, a clickbaity title that doesn't deliver on its premise, or like giving someone misleading deck advice would absolutely eat me up. Like, I'm an editor. When I find a mistake that I didn't catch before I publish something, y'all, I fixate on that shit for years. But also, on maybe a selfish note, I want other people to be good at deck advice because I want to receive good deck advice myself. And the number one thing that differentiates the good advice that I've gotten versus the bad advice, it's not how casual or competitive anyone is. It's not how often they win. It's not even about how long they've been playing. I've gotten some excellent ideas from brand new players. The thing that differentiates it is whether or not that person leaves room in the discussion for nuance. Broad statements about the quality of stuff can lead me towards being confused, because when it's just a broad statement, suddenly I've got questions about all of the corner cases, and that's distracting, and can I trust that advice, and yada yada. Whereas demonstrating that they understand how I got to where I'm at helps me understand where they are coming from, and that is what actually allows that advice to be heeded, you know? To put this another way, the best deck advice comes from the person who really wants to help, not from the person who's trying to appear like an authority or trying to look like the smartest person in the room. Even an expert can steer you in the wrong direction if they don't really care too much about helping you improve. And a person who doesn't know a whole lot can still help you find the right answers in discussions together. So critiquing popular and unpopular cards is fun and all, but underneath each one of those things, it's important to recognize that there are many, many complex factors about why cards get used and why they don't. And when you're talking about this stuff, you're not talking about abstract things. We're not even really talking about a data website. We're talking about the decisions that real people made, that real people make. So it sucks when sometimes I hear at game stores, on random videos, on deck forums, when people use language that's perhaps a little careless and that doesn't take into account those really important nuances that do help people improve. And even if, for some reason, you don't care about other people getting better at the game, frankly, universal statements also obscure your own ability to improve as a player, so you should still care. When you shorthand a complex issue with quick language, sometimes you miss out on stuff that could improve your game. I did that whole video about why Sol Ring isn't showing up in 100% of decks, and I learned a lot by doing it. Simply stating that Sol Ring should go in every deck would cause you to miss out on some genuinely interesting reasons why people avoid it. Heck, even just researching the Brainstorm example that I used earlier, I realized that it also showed up in one of the Warhammer precons, because that commander has cascade abilities, so Brainstorm could actually set up a more profitable cascade effect. And like when I saw that, I was like, oh shoot, that's cool too. Like I didn't think of that before, and that's neat. So now if I ever build a Cascade deck, or if I encounter one in the wild, that's something I'm going to keep my eye out for. We're never just talking about cards, we're talking about people, and those people may see the game a different way than you do, and you get better at the game when you can understand and approach it from those other different perspectives. Because, I don't know, if I'm missing something, well, I don't want to leave that value on the table, now do I? And on one final note, for those who've been keeping up on the podcast, yes, Joey is so desperate to get his Challenge the Stats segue that he had to make a whole other video just to get one. I see you out there. So those are my thoughts on challenging the stats, although really they're my thoughts on deck advice, but I'd love to hear from you. What techniques do you use to help other people out with their Commander brews? What do you do when you're challenging the data on EDHREC? And how do you help other people find cards that they'll enjoy? Let me know, and as always, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.